Hey everyone. Today we're going to talk about the thrift store pinch, why thrift stores in Ontario are struggling today when they were just coming into a blossoming, and that blossoming was halted very suddenly. We're going to talk about some of the struggles they face and how sometimes the judgments we put on them aren't totally fair. So let's talk about that. So there was a study that came out in BC by a credit union that was predicting a massive blossoming of thrift store chains or stores in Ontario. And BC had seen something similar. And there's economic triggers that happen that set this off. And it usually has to do with a province or an area where people stigmatize used things, right? So they're affluent enough that the idea of reusing someone's old stuff has a stigma to it. And so when certain economic things happen, like price of real estate goes up and rents go up, but income really doesn't, at least not enough to keep up with the cost of living, suddenly that stigma disappears and people get over it real fast. And then they're willing to start looking at buying used clothes, because what some people aren't willing to do is to scale down on the quality of the material they use. So someone who loves Chanel is going to always want Chanel, even if they can't afford it. So if they buy it used, roughly in a thrift store, you're paying a third of the retail price. So sometimes, even if it's not Chanel, but a higher end brand that you couldn't normally afford suddenly becomes affordable. And some of this stuff is so great, like brand new with tags on it. It's like shopping at Winners, not like shopping at a really low-end charity thrift shop. And so branding started to change. It used to be that thrift stores were pushed for the charity angle, and they were made available to the target market that is struggling financially. So when you go to a thrift store, you anticipate rock bottom prices, because isn't that why they're there? Thrift store still has to cover its costs, you know what I mean? So they can't be giving this stuff away, or who's going to pay their rent? And retail rent is expensive, and labor is expensive. So thrift stores had to somehow find a way to fill their stores, but improve the shopping experience, because the thrift stores we're used to are the low-end charity brands. They're 20,000 square feet, and you've got to go through mounds and mounds and mounds of crap to maybe find the rare gem. The new generation of thrift store is about half the size, and a lot of that size isn't even retail space, but actually used to sort clothing to find the pieces to put in the store, and they're better curated. So this way, everything in the store is great quality. Now it's just a matter of preference, and so it's an easier shopping experience. And although they don't carry the volume, the quality compensates for that. And so because you enjoy shopping there, it's not this overwhelming and depressing environment, you tend to go more than, let's say, those crappier thrift stores that you go to when you're broke, right? These better ones that are carrying, Kenzo sweaters, you know what I mean? It's hard to get depressed when you're shopping there because you're walking out with quality clothes. So it started to blossom, and instead of it being the big bloated chains we're used to seeing, it started to become mom and pop shops. So people that were fashionistas would start opening their little thrift stores, and it was very fashion forward and usually complementary to the fashion style of the family that owns it. So these started popping up like mushrooms all over Ontario, just as was predicted in that BC Credit Union study. The problem is these stores need stuff to put in it. So they all started partnering with various charities and private collectors, and there were lots and lots of them in Ontario to choose from. There were 17 grading facilities that also partnered with charities and collectors, and they would do the sorting for the stores. So the two models you could use is you either find a way to collect or purchase clothes that are unsorted, and then the store sort through it and pick out the stuff they're going to put in the store and sell the rest at a lower grade, like at a lower price. Or they purchase pre-sorted material for stores that don't have the processing space. But that's expensive when you're purchasing it pre-sorted, because the sorting is expensive, especially with Canadian labor costs, which is why the majority have moved to Dubai anyway. So now we're at the point where Canada is shipping its used clothing overseas only to have to buy it back to put in thrift stores. So imagine the complication and the struggle for thrift stores to get quality inventory. Now, it happens that the charities that are still collecting, that don't seem to be under this squeeze, are the ones that are getting all the municipal contracts in Ontario, or a lot of them, and are getting the most press and everything else. And they all sell to the same thrift store chain. So the Goliath is having no problem getting inventory. As a matter of fact, they get so much inventory, they boast that they export, 500 million pounds a year, whatever it is. So it's the smaller collectors and graders and thrift stores that are struggling. And so if bylaws are keeping you from collecting, what are you supposed to put in your store? And even when they are collecting, here's the other struggle. I was talking to a micro facility today. I think they only have 10 people that are sorting. It's very small. And it's only to fill one store. So they have their own staff just to fill their one store. So they don't need to collect a ton, you would think. So when we were speaking, I said, your store has such a small footprint. I don't imagine, you're feeling the crunch. And he says, what are you talking about? He says, I'm able to get the volume of clothing that I'm used to getting, or that I thought I would need to do this, from his experience as a very experienced man in the industry. He said, but Daniela, you have no idea the quality of clothing, how quickly it's degrading. Like this fast fashion, it's killing us. So he said that he has to sort through 350 pounds of clothing. And in that 350 pounds, he's lucky if he can pull out 14 pieces that are good enough to put in his store. And he said to me, and this store is in Toronto, it's a big store, in Toronto, and he said to me, Daniela, and I'm collecting from really good places. He says, so my odds are better than most in this industry because I'm collecting in good places. He says, but even then, it takes, to get 14 pieces, I've got to go through over 300 pounds of clothes. He goes, and that doesn't mean that it'll even sell, because I'll put those 14 pieces in the store. He goes, but just yesterday, we were pulling things off the rack that have been there too long. He says, and it was over 1,000 pieces that I just pulled out of my store. So, and his is a big store, but it's not a 20,000 square foot store. It's about half of that. So he said, I'm having a hard time finding the quality that people are now expecting from us. He goes, and I have to keep it as cheap as possible because people expect that they're going to get it next to free when they come here, but they don't realize that in my case, I'm paying to collect, because he doesn't buy clothes, he collects it himself. I'm paying to collect, and that's an expensive endeavor and stressful. And then I've got to pay to have it sorted, because his staff sorts, and then put out in the store to hope it sells. It's not an easy business model. And especially now where the areas you can collect are shrinking because of regulations, it's even more difficult. So then we have, newspapers that are demonizing export. Well, what else are we supposed to do? Tell me. Newspapers that think they know so much. So if export's bad, what's good? What's the good solution? Because we don't have one. And, in terms of judging thrift stores and how much they spend, thrift stores are expensive to run. Everybody thinks, oh, that charity has a thrift store, they must be rich. Not really. By the time you pay, first of all, whether you're a charity or not, your landlord charges the same per square foot. Charities don't get a break on, landlord fees or whatever. They still have to pay to, operate a business. So they're paying their retail, they're paying all the insurances that are required and licenses and permits and whatever else. They've got to pay for the hydro, they've got to pay for the heat and air conditioning, they've got to pay for their labor. It is a very expensive business to run. If you want to open, and I'm talking a quality thrift store, I'm not talking about a rinky-dink one, but one that will actually attract a clientele that's willing to spend $12 on an item instead of just $4, you're looking at $250,000. Easy to open a store like that. So people think it's simple, but it's not that simple. And then, of course, the advertising to let people know you exist so that hopefully they will come. And that costs money if you want to do it right. So just because Facebook's free, if you don't have organic reach, nobody's seeing your posts. So you've got to pay for that reach. So it's hard. It's a hard, tough business. So when you're going to that thrift store and you see an item that's $10 when you were hoping to get it for $2, look around and imagine what it would cost to actually run that place. And it's harder than it looks. And it's a tough job. And it's not glamorous, So I think sometimes we don't give the secondhand economy enough credit. and understand that now in the crunch of regulations where there's one thrift store chain, or two, sorry, there's two thrift store chain where all of Ontario's waste is being flooded to them. They get first pick, and everybody else is scrambling for crumbs because they've managed to convince politicians that all these poor mom and pop thrift shops or people are just trying to make a living for small family businesses are being disenfranchised, not to mention the small family businesses collecting and the small charities collecting that are also being disenfranchised to give competitive advantage to one foreign-owned Goliath. Have a good day, everybody.